Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Yesterday, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced the union budget for the year 2023 to 2024.
Honorable Speaker, I present the budget for 2023-2024. This budget hopes to build on the foundation laid in the previous budget and the blueprint drawn for India at 100.
This budget was announced at a time when India's economy is finally recovering from the effects of the pandemic. But its growth still remains a big concern. Over the past few years, India's exports have come down, inflation has remained high, and private players have been reluctant to invest in the economy. And right now, all this is happening when the war in Ukraine is still going on, and many fear that the global economy might go into a recession. Now, all these factors affect how people get employed, how much they earn, and what services are finally available to them. And this is why the budget is so important. Because through the budget, what the government is telling us is how it plans to spend money to solve these problems and how it will raise the required money to do so. In this episode, we are talking to Indian Express's Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the paper, about what the budget reveals this time. Udit, what would you say is your overview of this budget?
So my sense is that at one level, it's a fairly predictable budget, which continues to follow the broad growth strategy that government adopted in 2019 when it was re-elected. And that growth strategy had two central pillars. One was for the government to have the notion of the minimum government, so which was to say that government will not go out and splurge money and use it on populist schemes, and use the money on capital expenditure, which is basically, build more bridges and roads. And the other was to incentivize private sector to do the heavy lifting on moving the economy by investing.
Right, this government has basically wanted private players to invest in the economy, open new firms, start new projects, so that will generate more employment rather than the government doing too much of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, because, this is an ideological position, and those who believe in this or follow this can argue that, in the past when government did a lot of it, it did a lot of it very inefficiently and very suboptimally, and it actually didn't work. And there was a lot of crony capitalism, or all kinds of giveaways were there, freebies, and didn't really boost the economy. And the solutions actually lie in the private sector, which will very efficiently allocate resources, create lots of jobs, and create the kind of modern economy that India wants to be.
Right, so in that regard, let's begin by talking about one of the biggest highlights of the budget this time, the increase in capital expenditure. This time, the capital expenditure has been increased to 10 lakh crore rupees, which is more than double the amount of money that was allocated in 2020 to 2021. So talk about that number a bit. What does it tell us about the plans of the government?
So again, as I said, this is a very significant achievement by the government to keep pushing the capital expenditure year on year. As you noted that, over the last 3-4 years, it has now doubled. And these kind of increases we've not heard of in the past. There is a reason why governments have typically failed to push that way, because year on year, government budgets typically have a lot of committed expenditure. There are salaries, there are departments, there are schemes. You can't just all of a sudden change that. But what this government has been increasingly doing is compressing its total expenditure, not sort of expanding at the same rate at which it would typically have expanded. And secondly, in what it spent, it has switched from revenue, which is like saying paying salaries or running schemes, to capital, which is like making roads. So there is a flip side to this also, because obviously somewhere the money is being cut. And that is where a lot of other stories are of the budget, of where the cuts are in different schemes.
Right, and we'll talk about these cuts in a bit, but just talking about capital expenditure a bit more, we've talked about it in the past as well, that it has a multiplier effect. The fact that you're spending money to build a bridge, that is supposed to generate employment. The idea is that this will give money in people's hands, and then they can go out and spend that money, and that will boost the economy.
Yes. So, I mean, there is a salutary logic to capital expenditure. And I think all right thinking people will understand what the logic is, that if government spends in such a manner which increases the GDP, as we mentioned, that 100 rupees spent on capital expenditure has been shown to, boost the economy by 250 rupees. So, all those metrics about debt to GDP, is typically that saying that if you add 100 rupees of debt to your existing debt and that 100 rupees creates 250 rupees of GDP, then debt to GDP as a ratio becomes lower. So it's considered to be a good strategy that you can take debt and use it for capital expenditure. So that's the broader logic. But the thing to remember in this is that these multipliers that we talk about, they take time to happen, right? Because by logic, these are long gestation periods. Road making a bridge, or any import making, any of these things will take time. So while the multiplier is higher, there is also the thing that this will take time. It won't happen in a jiffy. And many economists who are concerned about the state of the economy have argued that sometimes you're saying that I'll give 5 injections 5 years down the line, when one injection right now would matter more.
Okay, so if the government is spending so much on capital expenditure and building these productive assets, the question is, where is it getting the money to do that? Because for the past few years, the fiscal deficit has been very high, which means that the government's spending is more than its revenue. So how does it plan to do that, keeping the fiscal deficit problem in mind?
So, one is obviously that however much the borrowings can help, but if you look at the revenue side, because that is the one which is getting compressed, you'll see, and you look at the budget documents, you'll find that on many schemes, budget allocations have been cut. And for example, Narega, which is a massive scheme in the last 2-3 years, and perhaps has always been, because it provides a certain basic social security. And that scheme, and we've seen that in the last 2-3 years, government has had to spend a lot more on Narega, even when we hear that a lot of activists say that it has still not spent as much in, say, 2021-22. That year, they spent almost 1 lakh crores on Narega, providing jobs. And in the current financial year, they had budgeted for 73,000 crores, but they ended up spending some 89 or 90,000 crores. So they're always exceeding what they had to, because there is so much stress in the economy. But in the next year's budget, that allocation has been dropped to 60,000. So you will see many such examples, even in the schemes that the Prime Minister himself perhaps has, led. You'll see several places where there are cuts happening. And that is the only way you can actually fund a surge in capital expenditure.
Right, in this budget, we've seen the spending on food, fertilizers, and petroleum subsidies come down, and also the allocations for PM Kisan have been cut.
Yeah, exactly. So there are many such examples where they have cut subsidies. And the hope here is that if the virtuous cycle of growth happens, then the person, suppose the one targeted person who was till now using Narega, would have got a job in, say, PM Awas Yojana, making that house, low-cost housing, and would not actually need Narega.
So instead of working on some rural project through MG Narega, the person is hypothetically building a bridge or a port.
Exactly. So, but the only slip in all of this is that there is no guarantee that all of this will happen in such a seamless manner. And there can be many who fall in between those cracks. And that is the worry, that if you take away the social security without knowing for sure that jobs are coming in the private sector, there can be a lot of stress, especially for the marginalized and the poor.
And Udit, does this cut in subsidies tie in with this whole Revdi narrative where many believe that these are essentially handouts?
Yeah, this is a slightly vitiated thing, because in economic literature, there is no such thing as a handout or a freebie or a Revdi. In economic literature, you look at things that the government has to do because the private sector will not perhaps provide them well. Now, who is to say whether expenditure on health, education is a Revdi or is a productive investment? There is a lot of literature which says that you should keep boosting your education and health investments, because they actually are going to finally assure whether you will become a great nation or not. There is no nation in the world who has become a superpower or really become an economic might without first investing in health and education. Now, we are seeing that even those numbers are down. From the budgeted numbers last year, which was said for health and education, those numbers are significantly down in the revised estimates, which is to say that we said we'll spend this much in the current financial year and we are not going to spend it eventually.
And have we seen that in both health and education?
Both health and education, yeah. So, and many such places like some of those subsidies, they've been dropped, presumably, say, fertilizer subsidies. Now, again, farm distress is something that has dominated the narrative for a while now. Last year, farmers had to pay in a huge manner on fertilizer and energy prices, right? Because of Ukraine war, both Ukraine being a provider of a lot of fertilizers and Russia being such a massive energy supplier. Now, there is no way that farmers have recovered those costs, higher costs. And so in the absence of that, there'll be stress. And there is more distress perhaps coming, which a lot of economists are pointing towards, that this is likely to happen because we've taken away the social security and left them on market forces, which are right now going against them.
Okay, so big push for capital expenditure, cut in subsidies, which is how the government plans to reduce the fiscal deficit. But the other thing you talked about in the beginning was the fact that this government has been wanting private players to invest. In what way does the current budget reflect that?
So the government realizes, I think, one thing that private players haven't come out to play in the last 3-4 years. Last year, some of the listeners might recall that the finance minister was quite exasperated when she asked, why isn't Hanuman flying? Where she was asking, why aren't the corporates essentially investing when we've given them all that was required? We've done reforms, GST, IBC, and corporate tax cut. Why aren't they doing it? So I think there is a realization in the government that this is not happening at the rate at which we want. So there is something called the crowding in, which is to say that the government would make a bridge, right, over and above what it was supposed to make. And this will create an environment for economic growth and people will join in. So if there is a bridge, then there perhaps would be a demand for cars, for two-wheelers, and hence the businesses will start investing because now there is increased demand for two-wheelers to cross.
So in this two-wheeler example, let's say Bajaj will start making more scooters because now there is a demand for it. And maybe that will lead them to open a new manufacturing plant.
Exactly. So just by making a bridge and bringing, say, two parts divided by a river or something closer, you've created an economy where people can now travel and actually come conduct business. The demand and supply both have increased. And now businesses find there is a valid case. They might start a small plant and start producing that thing. And everybody benefits just by that one action. And this is called crowding in. You crowding in other people, private sectors investments, and you're boosting economic activity.
But Udit, based on what we've seen in the past few years, this has not exactly happened, right? Despite making things easier for the private sector, private firms are just not investing.
Yes. So this is the problem, that private firms have largely not invested because of the consumption levels being weak. And now this goes back to the original growth strategy in 2019, where the government said that we will follow a strategy where we will incentivize supply side, which is to say that we'll go by giving tax cuts to the corporates and they will invest more because now the taxes are lower. Many economists at that time pointed out that the slowdown in 2019, and listeners would recall that between 2017 and 2019-20, the economy slowed down considerably from over 8% to under 4%. That slowdown, many economists argued, was a demand slowdown. That was not a supply slowdown, which is to say that people were consuming less because the joblessness was high and growth was faltering. There was not enough money that people had. At that time, the other strategy that the government could have employed was to give a similar tax break, not to the corporates, but on, say, GST or on direct income tax, but mostly perhaps on GST, to reduce the tax burden on people.
Basically, reduce indirect taxes, which is something that everyone pays.
Exactly. You reduce indirect taxes and you reduce the tax burden. People have more money in their pocket, they spend more. And when they spend more, there is a natural business case for companies to invest. Even though the tax rate has not gone down for them, they realize that, well, there is a profit to be made. But the reverse has happened because the government incentivized by giving a tax cut to the companies. All the data shows that the firms basically pocketed that money, put that in their profits. Their profits went up, their valuations went up, stock market soared, but they did not invest because they didn't find any valid business case.
And now, again, the government is hoping that by increasing capital expenditure, the private sector will invest this time. But now let's talk about another big thing that stands out in the budget and which is related to taxes. This time, there is a push for people to join the new tax regime, which was introduced in 2020. It was announced that now new taxpayers will by default join the new tax regime. And the rebate limit in the new tax regime was also changed from 5 lakh rupees to 7 lakh rupees. Could you explain to our listeners what that means for them?
Okay, so try to understand this. What was the old tax regime? The old tax regime is riddled with all these very intricate exemptions. If you take a house loan, then on the principal, you'll get 2 lakh here, rebate there. Your taxable income can come down for variety of reasons. You've taken an insurance, your taxable income can come down. You've taken a house loan, taxable income can come down. What was the purpose behind that? The Indian economy used this vehicle to incentivize household savings. What happens when you keep all this money, part with it instead of spending it? This money goes in the market as loanable funds. It is this money that the governments borrow, that the corporates borrow. Now, the old model was you have massive savings in an economy. That massive savings then translates into massive investments because the funds are there. Lots of funds are there. They are cheaper. They're available for investment. The new tax regime tries to do away with all exemptions in the bid to make it a simplified system.
Yeah, house rent you can't deduct, leave travel allowance you can't deduct, interest on home loan you can't deduct.
You can't deduct anything. It's a very clean slate. It's a very simple system. All very fine, easy to administer perhaps, easy perhaps to understand, but it has a massive contingency. It will have a tremendous impact on India's savings. You must have seen that the stocks of insurance companies, banks all fell sharply. Why? Because you've taken out the business case for many of these things. What was the forced saving has been taken away, by making this the default option. By the looks of it, the finance minister is determined, and maybe by next year, she might just say that the old scheme has to be scrapped at some length. So, the idea behind the new tax regime, new personal income tax regime, is that we'll keep it very clean, but it will have ramifications for India's savings rate. And when savings are not enough, you're hoping that people will actually spend this money. So this is where the argument is coming from, that when people are not saving that much, they might actually be spending that much, right? Or maybe going to the stock market, and the stock market might be doing well, or funds would be there or whatever. But the savings will take a huge hit, and savings have been taking a huge hit because, as I mentioned, people were not earning enough, so they were keeping their consumption up by cutting into the savings. And we've had terrible tragedies during the COVID period. So savings is something that is already low. And that's a bit of a casualty. And a lot of economists are pointing that will be an issue of concern for the macroeconomy.
And Udit, now that new taxpayers by default are joining the new tax regime, will they have an option to opt for the old tax regime?
Well, it is not very clear right now about this, but since the finance minister has not scrapped the old scheme, then I would suspect that there is an option for somebody to say, I do not want the default option, I want to actually use the older one.
Also, the other big highlight this time is that any person that earns up to 7 lakh rupees will be exempted from paying taxes. Could you talk about what stands out to you about that?
So, on the face of it, this sounds fantastic. anybody who earns 7 lakh will, or under 7 lakh, will not have to pay any tax, right? But the thing about income tax in India is that very few people actually pay it, right? So, and the per capita incomes are something like 2 lakh, nominal terms. So, you've set the exemption limit at 7 lakh, which is quite remarkably high. And that is one aspect of it. But the second aspect that jumps out to me is that on the face of it, yeah, it looks really good that nobody would have to pay taxes. But the actual number of people paying taxes and the amount that they pay taxes on in that bracket is very small. So I don't think it's either going to create as much of a consumption boost or is necessarily going to be such a huge benefit for everybody. Because in the old system, it was built on a life cycle approach where, when you have a house, you'll get some rebate, some exemption. You have kids, you have their health insurance, there's, school loans, college loans. Everything was built into that. This new system almost is a very staccato approach that, well, you don't have to pay any, you won't get any exemptions, pay a lower rate, but after 15 lakhs it will be 30%.
Okay, so let's imagine a listener who right now earns less than 7 lakh rupees per year, but, could get an increment this year. Does it make sense for him or her to join the new tax regime?
Yeah, so I don't really think that it does, until unless you're somebody who's going to stay in the less than 15 lakh bracket for a very long time or substantial period of your life. It perhaps doesn't make any sense to shift to the new regime. And at one level, 15 lakhs is not the kind of level, while 7 lakhs is a level where a lot of people will be exempt. For the India that is on the move, for the people in the tech sector and all the glitzy bit that of India that we know, 15 lakhs is not an amount that is so high that you will not reach. Very quickly in your career, you'll reach that. And you would at that time crave for, all kinds of exemptions because you would be buying a house, you might be buying insurance, and all of that in the old regime, you would have got an exemption.
Also, with the new tax slabs, the super rich who earn 15 crore rupees per year and more, they would also benefit from it. Could you talk about to what extent that would be the case?
So, the finance minister said that they'll, on the direct tax, on this personal income tax, the government will lose a revenue of the amount of around 35,000 crores or 37,000 crores, some amount of that nature. But most of that money would actually come from the rich people because the poor, less than 7 lakh, don't on the margin pay as much tax. As it is, nobody pays taxes. And less than 7 lakh annual income, they don't pay that much tax. Now, the problem with the rich is that while these are huge numbers, their rebates will run into 10, 20 lakhs, right? Just the rebate part, just the exemption that just the reduction that they've got from surcharges. But at that level, for the rich, that amount is not so big. And rich typically have a higher tendency to save, less to consume. The poor consume more. You give 100 rupees to a poor person, they are likely to spend almost all of it.
Because the day-to-day cost is so much.
Yeah. This is called the marginal propensity to consume. So the marginal propensity to consume for the poor is very high. And it's almost 1, or 9.9, which means 90 rupees would be gone quickly. Whereas the marginal propensity to save would be high in rich. You give them 100 rupees, they'll put 90 in the saving, right? Because they don't actually need their costs and their expenditures are already there.
And Udit, this budget has also been announced in the lead up to the 2024 Lok Sabha elections. Did we see any decision or any announcement that we thought was done keeping that in mind?
I think the tax, to government's credit, it doesn't seem like any of those decisions were taken. Now, the tax thing is something that has divided opinion. Some believe that this is the really populist thing. It has, it can be said that anybody earning up to 7 lakhs, which is a huge proportion of India's population, has been given a tax exemption, complete freedom. But If the counter argument is that they were not paying taxes anyway, income taxes, then in real terms, the fillip to consumption will not be that much. So some people are seeing this as a populist move, as something that will give the government a sort of narrative that it is a government which is pro-poor. And if the government can sort of sell it, then yeah, that will work. But I don't really think that they've done any kind of populist measures, which is not to say that they will not do it. But as I said in previous pieces and in other podcasts, is that this was in any case not expected to be the year when it will do it. Although 2024 is not a full-fledged budget when they present it, this government, being fairly confident that they'll come back, are likely to announce many of those things. For example, PM Kisan was announced in 2019, right? Just before the election. And it had a salutary impact. So I think if PM Kisan has not been touched this time, it is for a reason. They want to touch it maybe next year and increase it by a certain amount so that it has a certain tangible electoral gain. Right now, if you increase it, I don't know if people will remember it 14 months down the line.
Okay, so just to recap, big push for capital expenditure, subsidies being slashed, push for private players to invest, new tax slabs, and like previous budgets, we did not see much investment in health or education. But Udit, what are some of the other concerns that stand out for you that you think this budget does not address?
I feel that while the budget has a sound strategy on paper, it is not preparing the economy for an eventuality where these things do not work out. Let me point to the economic survey that just came out a couple of days ago. The economic survey's essential argument this time was that it was a tacit admission where they accepted that between 2014 and 2022, the economy has not grown as fast as everybody imagined it would. And they said that it was because there were all kinds of problems of NPAs, banks struggling with NPAs, companies struggling with a lot of debt that they had taken over. There was COVID, Ukraine, everything. But the fact remains that growth had not happened. Now, considering that we are coming out, and they believe that after 2023, growth will improve. But given the fact that there is an acceptance that growth has not been as good as we had imagined, one can easily understand that there must be a lot of stress in the economy. But the government has largely glossed over many of those sort of the difficult questions on inequality or the quality of jobs or the stress of low income, and not prepared the economy. Government's role in any economy is to provide that missing piece of the market puzzle. Markets, if they could solve everything and provide everything, then the governments were not required. The governments are required to just play that role of providing the last bit of effort to ensure that nobody just falls off the net. And I think to that extent, the budget misses a lot of things. The allocations not being there, especially for health and education or for some of the social security schemes, that can create trouble. Maybe not for you and me directly, but for millions of people in India.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Abhishek Kumar and was produced by Utsa Sermon, Anviti Singh, and me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.